Okay, welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar at Portland State University. My name is Leming Wang. I'm co-hosting seminar with Dr. Uni Krishna. And today we're very pleased to have Robert Liberty. Robert is kind of a true old hand in Oregon's land use and transportation arena. He's currently the Director for Urban Sustainability Accelerator at Portland State University. Before his current role, he was kind of a long list and distinct position. He was the staff attorney and director for 1,000 Friends of Oregon, a senior counselor to Congressman Earl Blumenauer. Okay, sorry for. And he was elected to the Metro Council in 2004 and reelected in 2008. And today's topic is three bridges. If the seminar has kind of a competition for shortest title, I'm pretty sure he will take home the trophy today. With that, I will just give the room to Robert.
Thank you, Li Ming. Good afternoon. I'm glad to be here. I'm talking about these three bridges, the Selwood Bridge, the Columbia River Crossing, the Tillicum Crossing. Not an equal amount devoted to each of those, but they have overlapping lessons that I learned in the process of my participation in this project development. The first and largest is the Columbia River Crossing. The Columbia River Crossing was a study project initiated shortly before I took office on the Metro Council. Most of the references I'm going to make are to the final environmental impact statement, although this project went on so long and it developed so many variants that you can find a variety of cost estimates or project descriptions. So I'll focus on the kind of main line, the locally preferred alternative, or the LPA, and everything I say is documented one way or another in the voluminous library for the project. What was the project? Well, actually, contrary to the very title, Columbia River Crossing, it was a very long freeway widening project beginning in Vancouver, crossing the Columbia River, and had major interchange improvements, a new bridge crossing of the North Portland Harbor, and light rail connecting from the northern terminus, the Yellow Line, into downtown Vancouver and crossing over to Clark College. This is what the project was cost and its component. I'm sorry, this is I'm not sure what happened here, but the freeway interchange improvements are actually, I hope we have the right one, $1 billion. I'm sorry, I better check and make sure this is the correct one. Anyway, the project cost was $3.6 billion, of which the bridge was $900 million, $900 million for the bridge, $850 million for light rail, and the freeway improvements, which were the interchanges at SR 500, Mill Plain, 4th Plain, Marine Drive, and the ramps on the south side, were a total of $1 billion. The demolition of the existing bridges was $90 million. I want to make sure, by the way, I have the right presentation, so this concerns me a little bit. This is the view looking north from the Oregon side, looking towards the North Portland Harbor, near the Marine Drive intersection of the current project. This is what it would look like in the locally preferred alternative. At Hayden Island, the island in the middle, the total lanes, including exit and on-ramps, are 17. This is the view looking south. From Vancouver, this is what the project would look like in the locally preferred alternative. Now, purpose and needs statement is really the definition used for the project, and it frames the analysis, so it's very important. This is a quote: "The specific needs to be addressed by the proposed action include growing travel demand and congestion, impaired freight movement, limited public transportation operation, connectivity, and reliability." Well, one of the things you notice about these statements is they're really describing the same thing, congestion. So three different purposes are really all the same thing. Safety and vulnerability to incidents, and substandard bicycle and pedestrian facilities. So safety and vulnerability to incidents refers both to seismic vulnerability and accidents. But what's interesting about the purpose and need statement to me is it's all very generic. How many places in our region could you identify where these would be issues? Possibly hundreds. The study area is shown in the middle image, and it runs from the Victory Boulevard up to the interchange on State Route 500. Now, why is that interesting? Because that is the area within which the analysis is made, and this is one of the key points. Your geography will determine a lot of your analytic outcomes. It's also interesting that on the same page it showed the Steel Bridge off to the left and the Ruby Junction. These are facilities for repair of light rail. Because of the increased capacity, they would have to be improved. So they're shown as a kind of a parallel as project areas. The larger area, this map, also very interesting. You see the Steel Bridge and Ruby Junction are called out because if light rail is additional expansion light rail system require improvements to these two locations. But what's not shown in any significant way is Interstate 205. So you have a project area that is very narrow, that is just 7 or 8 miles, and then you don't show the freeway system. There is the cost again by these segments. So what's notable about this is it's called the Columbia River Crossing. But depending on how you calculate it, less than a third of the project is actually crossing the Columbia River, and it's only about 12% of the project length. Here are the images again, looking north, looking south, the preferred alternative. This is the finance plan, also very important. Roughly 1/3 each from different sources. The federal government putting in $850 million for the light rail expansion, $400 million for highway improvements. By the way, when I brought this up at a hearing with the city council in the city of Portland, someone argued with me on the city commission and said, well, that's your opinion of the finance plan. Can't even agree on how the project would be funded. $1.2 billion from tolls, a very heavy lift, pardon the pun. $1 billion from Oregon and Washington, including some initial funding for the study, and then $150 million from other local sources. So back to the purpose and needs statement. As I said, all very generic. Seismic vulnerability. I'm going to talk about all of these except substandard bicycle and pedestrian facilities. We talked about the study area and the geography along with the purpose and need defines what's studied. So what's not included here is Interstate 205. The entire light rail section in this larger view is shown, but again the study area is only the several miles from SR 500 in Clark County, northern part of the city of Vancouver, down to just south of Marine Drive. This is a flow diagram showing trip origins and destinations. It's actually built up from what's much more detailed, showing every exit and entrance and the volume of traffic from it. What's interesting about it is, of course, a lot of the traffic is, almost all the traffic is local to the metropolitan area, and a lot of it is very local within even the study area. But what it doesn't show is that actually a lot of the traffic volume at the north never crosses the bridge. It originates from SR 14, just north of the Columbia River. So there's a lot of very local movement. Now this is interesting because the context is always an interstate freeway connecting Canada and Mexico. But it's very local traffic, and the images actually don't show here the fact that a lot of the volume of the traffic farther north, where there's massive investments in interchange, is local and does not cross the bridge. So one of the chief arguments is growing travel demand and congestion. This is a report by URS, I think now merged into AECOM, prepared for the city of Portland. And it talks about what the traffic will be like in 2020. 2030 was also used for some reports. And it compares the no build versus the 12 lane. Now, you notice it said 17 lanes on Hayden Island. All the exit and off ramps weren't considered lanes. In fact, we were told there's only 3 through lanes in each direction. But there were 17. So here's the difference in 2020 between not building it and building it. This is the morning peak southbound, 1 minute. The northbound peak, the difference is 8 minutes. Okay, so we're talking about a $3.6 billion investment, at least $2.8 billion for freeways, in order to save 1 minute by 2020 or 8 minutes northbound. Well, my first question is, what are other wastes of time? Why is 8 minutes or 1 minute so important? Let's say that's 9 minutes a day. Well, here's an interesting statistic. From the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Americans watch, by the way, this is very much lower than what the TV networks say, 2.8 hours per day. Average amount of commercials is 16 minutes per hour. So in other words, if you watch television, you have about 42 minutes of commercials you watch. So what if we bought TiVos for everybody and just cut out 8 minutes of commercials? Maybe that would be a lot cheaper. Question is, what is 8 minutes of delay worth? I think the other question is, why is that congestion the most valuable? There's congestion everywhere. Why spend that amount of money to save 8 minutes and 1 minute? You don't ask that question when you have a small study area, because you're only looking within the study area. This is another point that was rather obvious, is that the crossing was 12 lanes or 17 lanes or 6 lanes or whatever you want to call it, very large. You saw the images. What is Interstate 5 near the Coliseum? 4 lanes. That's not in the study area. It's outside the study area. So didn't analyze that. But of course, URS noted that speeds of less than 20 miles an hour because you're taking a big pipe and putting it into a small pipe. So if you need to fix that, you have to fix the entire length of I-5 going through the I-84 intersection. It's not in the project area, not part of the project analysis. So I asked this question, why this congestion more important than any other question? It's not asked in this study or any study. This is research done at Portland State, local causes of congestion. You can see capacity bottlenecks is the red pie slice, 40%. But signal timing and incidents are also 40%. So if you wanted to reduce congestion, you could work on any of these others. And actually, I think it's interesting, construction work zones are 10%. No project I've heard of ever analyzes the amount of delay caused by the construction of the project and offsets that against the benefit of future reduced congestion. Here's another obvious point. The project required $1.2 billion in tolls. By the way, the project descriptions at the beginning never described tolling as part of the project. That's a finance mechanism. Well, you all know tolling is demand management. So look at this result. Massive diversion to Interstate 205, which is not in the project area and therefore not a part of the project. But this is a statement of the obvious. I-205 and I-5 and these crossings are part of a network. It's part of the interstate system. And so it's going to greatly affect travel movements if you toll one and not the other, which was the proposal. So what's the consequence? This is where we were right before the beginning of the analysis. 124,000 trips per day on I-5 and 136,000 on I-205. With the no build, this is very important numbers. It's interesting because they forecast a very high level of congestion, 7.5 hours per day, 140,000 trips, and a shift to I-205, 155,200 trips. With the build, the volume goes up on I-5 quite a bit to 178,000 and remains steady. That's very interesting. At 2020, the traffic on I-205, they forecast, would be the same as 2002. So a big benefit for those commuters. But if it's tolled, the traffic volume on I-5 shrinks back to what it was in about 2004. And if you toll both, the total volume shrinks. That's called trip destruction. You know, people choose not to make things. What's interesting about this is the freeway is sized to handle this increased volume, but the tolling mechanism cuts down the traffic. So it's like widening the door and then installing a turnstile. Why wouldn't you start by figuring out the effect of the tolls, then size the bridge according to that, and make the tolls part of your management system? Another big issue is freight movement. So all the time in the press there was discussion about the effect of the economy. So this is actually a more dispassionate framing of it from the final environmental impact statement. Congestion on I-5 reduces freight mobility between regional markets in Portland and Vancouver. as well as national and international Mexico or Canada destinations along the I-5 corridor. Now remember, most of the traffic, overwhelmingly the traffic, is local. As hours of congestion continue to increase over time, this increases delivery times and raises shipping costs. It also negatively affects the region's economy. This is standard in every analysis. Slowing freight down hurts the economy. I'd like to find some areas with booming economies and no congestion. Obviously, it's not determinative because some of the strongest economies have the highest level of congestion. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying, what is the economic effect? Here's a little illustration. Here's 2 bottles of wine. Pinot Noir, 2013 from Primarius Winery, and the Terlato Charpentier Shiraz Viognier, 2012. Both highly rated. $16 here in Portland. Distance to the vineyard, 44 miles, Dundee. Portland price, $16. Distance to the vineyard, 8,100 miles. It's from Ballarat in Victoria State in Australia. How critical is freight? Turns out it's 1 to 5%. So if it's 1 to 5% generally, this is from a logistics analysis, and you were to add a few minutes on the travel time, it's a tiny fraction of 1 to 3% or 1 to 5%. It's just not accurate to say it's critical to the economy. Now, you may want to do that, but how important is it, and how important is it to other objectives you're trying to meet? This is Siskiyou Summit. This is on Interstate 5. And to the extent we have snowy winters now, it's often closed. That means delays of hours. Well, if we're interested in long-distance freight movement, wouldn't it be cheaper to increase having a plow standing by, or for that matter, put heater coils in the freeway? What difference does it make where you save 5 minutes of time? If your point is long-distance travel, you would save it where it's cheapest, not where it's most expensive in a metropolitan area over a river. Seismic vulnerability. Many of you, I think if you watch this debate, were told the bridge is going to fall down, it's collapsing. This is the 2009 Bridge Condition Report. Anyone recognize what bridge they're inspecting? What is it? It's the I-5, one of the I-5 bridges. There's 2. They're on the bridge inspecting it. They do it every other year. Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to tell you what the result was. So there's a classification structurally deficient. There's about 30 to 40 bridges on Interstate 5 in Oregon classified structurally deficient. The 2 bridges here are not. They have a rating of each section, and the rating is fair. It's not great, but it's a lot better than other bridges. So why are these bridges the ones that require replacement? They're not structurally deficient, they're rated fair, and they're better than 30 or 40 other bridges on Interstate 5. But let's talk about seismic vulnerability. This was a study done in 2009. By the way, you can see these studies going at the same time we're having this debate. That's the cover. And I believe Portland State University was involved in the study along with the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries. And they modeled a set of earthquakes around Oregon. The ones in western Oregon, this is one they modeled, which is a 9.0, which is just about the highest level of magnitude, Cascadia subduction zone quake. And the little circles indicate bridge collapse, extensive damage, or moderate or slight. If you look in Portland, you notice there's no bridge collapses, and most of it's moderate and slight. In fact, this is actually their analysis. And by the way, someone told me, oh, they didn't look at liquefaction. They looked at everything. 5 slight damage, 1 moderate, none extensive, no complete failure. Bridge repair replacement, $8 million. So this is ODOT produced this report. Yet we were told the bridge would collapse. They modeled another earthquake, which would be a 6.5 located about 2 miles from us under the, or a 7.0 and a 6.5 located about 2 miles from us, so right under the West Hills. That's bigger than anything we know about the geologic record. And looked at it again, and there was a lot more damage. But you can see there's no collapse. I think there might be one collapse in that area. This is the conclusion. So the first is they're modeling these different earthquakes. CSZ stands for Cascadia Subduction Zone in the north and south. And these are in Multnomah and Clackamas County, so everything on the state highway system in Multnomah and Clackamas County, including the I-5 bridge, and what the cost would be. So the maximum earthquake loss is $511 million, but the total retrofit cost to the highest level, which is phase 2, is $446 million, $4 million in the appropriation they sought for the project. And that would retrofit 95 bridges. But the bigger question is this. These are images from Christchurch, New Zealand. I was there shortly after this earthquake. My sister lives there. If you're going to spend money on earthquake preparation, what are you going to spend it on? There's 2,200 schools in Oregon that need seismic retrofit. I think it's a big question about whether you want to keep water running or automobiles running. So the question is, what is your priority? And given that there are many other bridges that would collapse, it's not even clear I-5 would be open because the overpasses would fall. But this is the big question. How are you going to spend your money? What is the actual risk? Accidents and incidents. So this was featured prominently in a lot of the discussion, which is high volumes of accidents on the crossing. And if you look toward the top of the left, you'll see that they're clustered on Hayden Island. Now, why is that? Anyone know? Coming in and on and off, and very short entrance ramps, because the bridge was, these were designed in the 1950s. So that's not a current standard, which is why they call it functionally obsolete. Not structurally deficient, but didn't have the right, there's not enough room to merge. So there's all these accidents there, hundreds of accidents. And then, of course, that causes a lot of delay. But in the project report itself, they note that there's two classifications, HAL and HAC. There were no locations of severe accidents in this section. Why? Because the accidents occur during merging at rush hour, which means the cars are going 15 and 20 miles an hour. They're fender benders. So what is the highest priority if you're concerned about accidents? This certainly has an effect on congestion. But if you're concerned about life-saving, you would look at another corridor, which is State Highway, 82nd Avenue, about 10 miles from here to the east. Report in January 2008 about 82nd Avenue Corridor of Roses. It's a 7.3-mile section of 82nd Avenue from the northeast Killingsworth out by the airport down to the Clackamas County line. It carries a lot of transit and truck traffic. It's mostly 4 lanes, 12-foot lanes. Here's the crash data summary. 11 fatalities, 81 injuries of type A severity, 430 injuries of type B severity, non-incapacitating, 1,178 injuries of type C, pain, and 3,747 total reported crashes. Well, if you want to deal with something with saving lives and reducing accidents, where would you do it? Over a river or on 82nd Avenue, where you could affect a lot more benefits? What about the alternatives that were done, and why did they come up with this alternative? Well, this is a very important point for me, which was there was a set of criteria that were non-quantitative and were values, which is fine, but they were used to screen a large number of alternatives before any analysis had been done of how the alternatives would function. So the alternatives were studied in the sense they talked about them, but they actually never conducted an analysis of what they would do. That is a very big problem, I think, in how we handle our analysis. Here's an example of a different approach. This is our freeway network as of about 1990. And there's a proposal to continue to build the Outer Beltway. This is the Western Bypass. I read this article by John Pucher at Rutgers, which has a title only planning students would love. But what he talked about was, why do Americans drive so much? Is it cultural or is it something else? And his answer was, Americans go to Europe, they don't drive, so it's clearly not cultural. And he looked at all the policies, and one of them was our land use patterns. I was involved with this project in developing this alternative, which was to model a different land use pattern so people wouldn't have to use cars on freeways. And I learned a lot from this. And one approach on the left here is a standard suburban approach of segregated uses and a dendritic system of roads versus a a grid and a lot of options of how to travel. So the Lutrec alternative said, we'll change land uses, we'll do demand management, we'll make the investments in transit. The western part of the light rail system had not yet been built. And if we combine those, what kind of results can we get? Well, it turns out that this alternative outperformed the highway. In congestion relief, 53% congestion relief versus 4%. And in access to jobs. It greatly expanded the number of jobs within a 30-minute travel time. So more access to employment, lower congestion. And what was interesting about it is this alternative was adopted. So that western bypass was not built. And this became part of the basis for the scenario planning done at Metro. There are a lot of equity issues that were never addressed. For example, a simple one. So someone moves to Clark County for whatever reason, north of Vancouver, and wants to work in Portland, and they're in congestion. So now the taxpayers of the United States and Oregon and Washington will come up with $3.6 billion to make their trip 1 or 8 minutes shorter. Why? What are the incomes of those people? What are the incomes of people paying the taxes? What are the incomes of the people breathing the pollution next to the freeway? What about other people wanting to get to work? There's 18,000 people a day on the number 4 bus. What would it cost to take 4 minutes off their travel time? None of those questions are asked. I mean, it was reduced to a very simple kind of analysis of air pollution impacts. What about the effect on reducing property values, not just next to the freeway, but when you create new access and new interchanges, commercial uses gravitate to those locations, emptying out another retail opportunity. Not discussed. And here's the end. After 10 years, shut down, terminated the whole project. Note, the project's called the CRC I-5 bridge replacement. So from beginning to end, it was called the bridge replacement, when that was actually only a third of the project. Cost of the study, $200 million, which would have been enough to actually do quite a bit of good. Move on to the Selwood Bridge. This is the bridge that's now under construction. This is the bridge that's being replaced. That bridge was built in 1925. It was a cheap contract, cheap design, and it had a lot of structural problems. And people said to me, I was on the Metro Council during this time, and I was actually on the policy advisory group for this project, but it's a county bridge. They said, I'm afraid to drive over it because I'm concerned it'll fall down. Here's the context, by the way. So on the north end, you see downtown Portland, the south end, Lake Oswego, and the Selwood Bridge is in the middle south of that island. This is a close-up. This is showing, from Google Earth, showing some of the construction. You'll notice there's quite a bit of construction. Yes, Li Ming. Thank you. You'll see a lot of construction on the west bank, the freeway. Well, this is the road that approaches the bridge. It's called Tacoma Street. And it was the subject of a lot of planning by the citizens. And the citizens said, we want to shrink it and make it a main street. And that's what happened with a few turn lanes. And that was put into the regional plan as a main street. So it's interesting that when the Selwood project began, and the problems that were identified included inadequate structural integrity. The bridge is old and not holding up well, unsafe road design, and the sidewalk was like this. I mean, I would never ride my bike on that. I always walked it over because it was very narrow. But then it says existing future travel demands between origins and destinations served by the Selwood Bridge exceed available capacity. But wait a minute, Tacoma Street is not going to be expanded. And actually the committee agreed in their direction, no, we're not going to expand Tacoma Street. But the first thing that struck me after the project was approved was that the bridge that no one wanted to travel on because it was going to fall down is actually moved and put on temporary piers. There's actually people who said, no, actually the bridge it's not great, but it's not in terrible shape. The problem is the west approach, where the West Hills are moving east and crumpling up the bridge approach. But if the bridge was so dangerous, why would you move it and put it on wooden pilings and use it as a temporary bridge? This is the bridge under construction. This is the diagram used about sorting the alternatives. What I found interesting, though, on the committee was, this is actually another advisory committee later in the project, these committees are very big. The consultants have a long agenda. So for the Columbia River Crossing, there were 39 people in the committee. So let's say you have a 2-hour meeting and you have 8 major items with briefing for each of them. You might be able to ask one 15-second question, get a 45-second answer. That's the level of participation from these committees. Because they're overwhelmed with material and they're actually directed by the consultants. In fact, when I first served in the Policy Advisory Committee, when they said we want it seismically safe, I asked this question, what do you mean seismically safe? Now you know what I mean by asking that question. This is what the consultant said, Counselor Liberty, seismic means earthquake, so it means safe in an earthquake. Right. I kept my cool, but I realized that was kind of the approach, which was to manage the policymakers and to keep things moving along the direction that was, I think, favored from the beginning. So when we got to the sorting, this was the price range for the alternatives that were acceptable because there was no rehabilitation or renovation of the bridge included. So the low end is, and these are, by the way, all the low end of all the options, $301 to $349 million. What was interesting, though, was that the people using the bridge are from Clackamas County, but it turns out they weren't going to pay for it. The other thing that was interesting was, where did this come from? This is now used to screen the alternatives. Providing free-flow north-south movement on Oregon 43, which is the road to Lake Oswego through the bottom level of a new interchange, the no-build alternative would not allow free-flow traffic movement because it would maintain the existing signalized intersection. Where did that come from? I thought this was about a defective bridge. Now it's about travel time to Lake Oswego for people who don't cross the bridge. This is what became the locally preferred alternative, the exchange interchange on the west side. That costs $113 million. So that has nothing to do with getting back and forth on the Solid Bridge. That has to do with going to Lake Oswego by people who don't use the bridge. And there's the bridge under construction. So the project's now $315 million. You take a look at those numbers because that's going to be important at the next, the final discussion of the Tillicum. And this was in the final environmental impact statement. Funding sources, any of the build alternatives, not resolved. So we went through the whole process, and I asked at the beginning, how much money will it take and what's the money available? And I said, we're not going to deal with that now. To me, that seemed irresponsible. And I made a motion that the consultants come back with an alternative of, I think I said, under $100 million, no matter what it was, so the county that could make the decision could choose from a cheaper versus a more expensive alternative. But the county was given a choice between $301 and $350 million. So it was not possible to make the consultants actually come up with a less costly alternative to consider, and it turned out to be a big political mess because the people who were using the bridge didn't pay for it. The last bridge, Tillicum Crossing. I'm glad to say that this project I supported. That's the resolution endorsing what was a much larger project, a 7.3-mile light rail extension to Milwaukee. It had been in gestation for about 15 or about 20 years with 10 stations and 1 reserved and a new bridge. There's the image of the bridge, and there's the bridge. So remarkably similar. Now take a look at these numbers. 1720 versus about 1920 for the Selwood. 72.5 feet wide versus 64 to 88 for the Selwood. Width of towers, 110. Width of multi-use paths, 14 feet each side. 77.52 feet, so slightly higher, but virtually the same as Selwood Bridge. Cost $126 million. So this bridge costs 2/3 of the cost of a bridge of very similar dimensions. This is an agency known for getting projects on time and under budget. And the other interesting thing about this is a story in which I don't look so great because there was a committee created to deal with bridge aesthetics, and I opposed that because I was concerned about the total project cost. And they brought designers, architects, and engineers together, and the result was the design you see now, which was cheaper and safer. That is great project management. So, oops, sorry. Now, to wrap up, what would I do to change these systems? One is I would have more specific purposes, numeric goals. Our goal is to reduce congestion by 15% by the year 2030, or reduce traffic deaths from 82 to 15, or reduce greenhouse gases by 15%, or give people, add 500,000 more job access to at least 100,000 more people. As compared to what? Compared to what? How much money spent on this versus spent on another project? Compared to other projects, compared to other ways of achieving the same objective. Allow policymakers to make policy decisions. Now, the truth is a lot of elected officials actually don't want to make decisions. I know that sounds shocking, but they want to be elected officials. But there are a bunch of them who feel it's their duty to make decisions, and they need to have actually a process that allows them to make the policy calls. Funding trade-offs. Again, compared to what is also about cost. If we spend money on this, we are not going to have money for that. That question is never discussed. It's amazing. There's a limited amount of money. If we spend it all on this, these projects go away. Why don't we compare those projects to see which ones achieve more of our objectives? There's a bias to building things as opposed to things like demand management or incentives or changes land use. And that's because the consultants are often involved with firms that design and do design build. So they're interested in building something big. Plus, you know, psychologically it's more gratifying to say, I built this new bridge than to say I instituted signal optimization. This is something I think is important. We ought to have the consulting firms go after each other and critique each other's analysis and make that part of the process so that the elected officials can hear different points of view and challenges to the technical competence or projections being made by their consultants. We need benefit cost return on investment analysis. Now, typically this doesn't come from someone who cares about the environment or social equity, but actually I think we can quantify all those things, and I think it can be useful for a multi-spectrum analysis of cost and benefits, not just taxpayer costs, but impacts on community health, on land values, on job access. Now, this is standard practice in other places. This is from the Eddington report from December 2006. I actually met the staff person, Oliver Jones, who worked on the report. This is a scattergram of benefit cost return. The benefit cost return ratio is the vertical axis, and the horizontal is the cost of the project. And you notice that projects costing over £1 billion have very low returns. I asked him about how he produced this, and he started to explain what a scattergram was. And I said, no, Oliver, I know what a scattergram is. Where do you get this benefit cost return number? And he said, well, it's standard practice. Don't you do that? There's a big roar of laughter from the Americans. So that's why we're here talking to you. So this is used in Canada, New Zealand, I think British Commonwealth countries, and is a simple form of discipline. And finally, we need post-implementation performance review. I asked at the beginning of the Columbia River Crossing, I said, I wanted to find a comparison, and I called the Department of Transportation. I said, how much did Interstate 205 cost? What was it supposed to do? And how did it perform? So I knew the first question was the easy one. Actually, they couldn't answer any of those. No one. They couldn't tell me how much it cost. They couldn't find the purpose statement. They had never evaluated it. Well, there's no incentive for improvement. In fact, there's incentive. The worse you make congestion, the more money you get. So we actually need to have performance evaluation built in, and that can only happen if the project has defined, quantifiable sets of objectives. Now, if we do all those things, we'll all be much happier. Thank you. Yes?
Realistically, if you have multiple companies verifying each other's work, are you also asking them to propose different alternatives to somebody says, oh, I have a Selwood Bridge option, and are you asking the other company to check to see if that's viable or even design a new bridge? If you bring in multiple companies, doesn't that dramatically increase costs?
Compared to what? Right? Look at what we're getting when we have a sole source analysis. So I think industry standard is 3, 4, or 5% on analysis before you make the project. So I'm not worried about that. And this is what I would do. I'd say we have thematic approaches, for example, to congestion. So one is demand management, one is land use alternatives, one is capacity expansion. Then there might be other things about technology. You could take 4 companies and say, here's our goal. So it's going to have we want you to show that you reduce congestion at least by 20% over no build. That's, by the way, this is a bigger issue, which is why would you pick an area to do that instead of saying in the region? But let's say you had an area. And we're going to give a contract, each of these 4, to play with that theme. So one will be capacity increase. One will be changes in land use, demand management, technology, maybe other things. And they can do little hybrids, but we want them to follow that theme. And then show the results. That's round 1. Round 2 is then you go, all that information analysis is public. The firms go over and attack, critique the others. Now, out of that, you're not going to pick one of those, but you're going to say, wow, it looks like a mix of this and a little of that. Have that hybrid go out in slightly different forms to another set of teams. They do the same thing. Then you have a bunch of alternatives where you actually know costs and have some idea about performance, and from there you make a decision. And then what's going to happen is if you start instituting this, the project proposals are going to shift because people are actually going to find out what works. We're going to monitor evaluation, and that will change what comes in the door. Now, I want to be very clear about this. There are always policy calls. People can make a decision about whether they care more about time than public health. That is a perfectly appropriate thing for elected officials to do. So I'm not talking about creating a machine which gives you a number and says this is best. That's not possible or appropriate. But I am saying a much more rigorous review and looking at what the impacts are on the taxpayer, on the community, and what the benefits are, and looking at options, and then make your political call. Yes, sir.
Urban Regional Planning. With respect to the Selwood Bridge, I live in Selwood. I know that that's a county bridge and that financing is, I think, Multnomah County only and not Clackamas County, which doesn't make any sense to me. So 2 questions, why wasn't it a joint county approach as far as financing? And then also was tolling, given that Tacoma Street is something that is not going to be enlarged, was tolling something that was considered?
The answer to the first question is that should have been a part of the project creation, and the chair of the Clackamas County Commission was Lynn Peterson at the time, who is now the Secretary of Transportation for Washington State, and by the way, very sophisticated thinker about transportation. Politically, it would have been hard. I would have had some sort of public discussion about, are you willing to chip in? And if the answer had been no, or it seems unlikely, I would have rethought the project budget. Because remember, people in Troutdale, through their registration fees, are paying for a bridge they almost never use. There's an equity question there. So I would have started with political feasibility and financial feasibility. By the way, you'd never have a transit project that began that way. The money would be pretty much gathered or identified before you get rolling on the study. It's just not the custom to come up with a project and find the money. On tolling, it was considered, but only briefly, and it was way too hot politically, and it's kind of a local bridge. By the way, ODOT was told to study tolling by the legislature. Never did, really. So that's another thing. ODOT's been given various instructions that they haven't done. No one ever calls it to account. So another point was I was on the Metro Council, and I was on the advisory committee for the Lake Oswego streetcar. And I said, I don't see any discussion here about the streetcar. And they said, well, we would like to design it to go over. And I said, well, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about it's going to go under or over or through the intersection. No one had talked about that. So there was a lot of discussion about how to redesign the interchange to deal with that. Yes, ma'am. Or sir, I'm sorry. Yellow.
Excuse me. I just find it amazing that Matthew Garrett still has a job, and I don't what's it going to take to? I know that you're not just talking about ODOT, and everyone always beats up on ODOT. I mean, what's it going to take to really change that organization? And they just seem like a dinosaur that just keeps on moving forward somehow.
There's some people on at least the last time I talked to the people in the commission, like I forgot his first name, Dave Frohnmeyer's son. It's actually pretty critical about the Columbia River crossing in public, which is difficult to do. And then there was a woman I knew from Corvallis, whose background in forestry, who challenged whether or not they were honoring their own requirements for various grants, and she was asked to leave by Governor Kitzhaber. So it's a small coterie of people. They're locked in with the unions and others. By the way, I don't think ODOT is worse than average. I think ODOT is average. I think this is an American problem. But your question's a good one, and it calls to mind a recent press release from the governor's office, the new governor's office, that they asked for an ODOT evaluation commissioned by ODOT. And one of the examples it gave of the problem was a $100,000 item to study, overseas transit. So, I mean, to me, that speaks volumes, right? Too much for a consulting contract, $100,000, and not what happened to a project that cost $200 million, or the Eddyville cutoff, which is another project that went $150 million over budget, which is to save a few minutes travel time through the Coast Range. These are fundamental. So I guess the question is, I can't answer your question. Apparently, several $100 million is not enough. That's what we know so far. Patty?
It seems to me, unless your analysis of the Columbia River crossing was about asking the right question. I mean, you asked a lot of questions, like the Siskiyou Pass, for example. It seems to me that the way to approach this would be that any federal money has to go through a set of federal criteria that go back to the very reason for the interstate system. So we know what the purposes of the system are, and if the project doesn't directly fulfill the purposes of the system, one needs to set the question in a statewide or interstate manner, then it doesn't qualify for federal funding. The question that was actually asked for the Columbia River crossing, it was raised by the freight handlers at Port of Portland and Port of Vancouver, that they had too much delay for getting freight onto and up the I-5 corridor. So the question that was asked was, how do we improve freight movement within the I-5 corridor? Well, obviously that's a far too narrow a question. And the two dots, WashDOT and ODOT, said, oh, we know how to solve that problem. It's just a matter of capacity and getting the capacity of all the interchanges right and so on, which is why we ended up with a project with 6 interchanges initially, 5 latterly, and then, there's a bridge in the middle, which gives the whole thing its name. So that was obviously not strategic in the way it was put together. It was very particular. And one needs somehow to raise the decision-making to a strategic level, a federal level perhaps, certainly to a state level, in order to get the question approved and begin work.
Well, actually, if that had been the way the question was posed and we were limited to that, we could have found a lot of solutions that were a lot cheaper. One of the issues is freight movement by rail versus by truck.
Included.
Yeah, which is not included, even though there's a freight bridge just downstream, and there was an overlapping issue about having the bridge lifts. And it would have been possible that to have I-205, I thought, have a freight lane with variable tolling on it, and linked to widening I-205 at the southern end to 3 lanes in each direction. So politically, it would have been possible to do that. But I think actually a lot of people weren't that interested in freight movement. They were interested in general capacity expansion for commuting. And the other thing I've noticed is when the political momentum gets going, it doesn't matter what you say. It's just impossible. So you have to start at the beginning and talk at a very fundamental level. So I think a question about freight movement would have been a perfectly good starting point, and people would have said, well, I would have said, why this movement? What's important about it? Do we care if Twinkies are moved more rapidly? Or is it about certain kinds of things?
But it was within the I-5 corridor.
Yes.
So,
So,
and therefore, I-205 was not looked at. Rail freight was not looked at.
And I think the other interesting thing about the port question is if this was part of a conversation about making the ports operate in a unified way, so with rail and shipping, marine freight and trucking, that would have been very interesting. We could have come up with something if we thought that was important, was very creative, and used all those systems. A lot of questions. I'll start with you in the middle, sir, and then work out.
So NEPA processes that you described with the purpose and need and the LPA are designed to rubber stamp projects. They're rarely canceled. Why was this one canceled?
Well, not for the question was why was it canceled, and not for reasons having to do with its lack of merit. It was canceled because there was a big uproar over funding transit from very conservative legislators in Clark County. who would said some things occasionally on blogs that were pretty hair-raising about minority criminals coming over and stealing. I mean, I don't know about you, but all the time I see people with big plasma TVs on the Macs, you know. If you wanted to intercept criminals, I think you'd start with cars, actually, right? So there was a amount of racism and fear. The other thing is that the right wing has now targeted investments in transit as part of a general agenda, Agenda 21, or urbanism, and therefore threatening. In fact, in the past, and still today, there's a lot of conservatives that are very interested in transit, partly because they see it as cost-effective or achieving other objectives. But it's been polarized. So I would like to say it was killed for lack of merit, but I think primarily it was killed. Well, actually, there was one other element. Washington State had even bigger projects, the Alaska Way Viaduct, a boondoggle if there ever was one, a $5 billion project to bury 2 miles of a viaduct without any capacity increase in an area subject to a lot of seismic movement, which is fill underneath the waterfront. In fact, the way these debates go, when people actually saw the cross-section in the paper, they said, wait a minute, there aren't any more lanes. Washington said, yeah, we've never added more lanes. It's not about capacity. And there's a big uproar, which means no one, they have talking points. They're not even aware what the project is. People know about this project. The largest excavator, tunnel maker built, I think, from Switzerland, or assembled on the waterfront, is now stuck. And they believe it was because it ran into probes inserted by the Department of Transportation. So it's going to have a huge cost overruns. That was one, and then a new floating bridge, and then a freeway in Spokane, and those cost billions and billions and billions, and that's the center of power, and Clark County is the periphery. However, as all these debates, like the Western Bypass or the Mount Hood Freeway, there's been a big increase in our intellectual capital in the region. So my question is, would this happen again, or will we have a different conversation? Yes, sir.
Michael Flynn, Civil Engineering. My question is mostly around the Selwood Bridge. So how did these stakeholders inject these requirements into the bridge proposal, like the free movement to Lake Oswego? And were they stakeholders, or was there another avenue by which those requirements were added?
I can't answer. I don't think it came from the Policy Advisory Group. That showed up in draft reports, and no one questioned it. You have to understand what the discussion's like. There's a briefing, then there's a few comments, and then the consultant says, move on. So it's never, where are these things coming from? I don't know. But one thing I do know is that because the Selwood Bridge is a local facility and Highway 43 is a state facility, ODOT put money into the interchange. The problem was that widened the bridge, because what you're actually doing is pulling traffic off 43 onto the bridge where it merges. So that made the new bridge more expensive, and that was allowed people to get off, avoid congestion on 43, go up Taylor's Ferry, or get to Lake Oswego. Well, that might be a worthwhile thing, right? But why is that the Selwood Bridge project? I mean, at one point they had, Lynn Peterson was there with me, and I said, you watch this PowerPoint. They have 105 cross-section on the West Bank, which is like 5 lanes merging. And she said, no. And I said, yes. She said, no. I said, you watch. And it came up, and there was 105 feet. So what that is doing is actually parking the cars over the river and allowing them to merge so people can get to Lake Oswego, or out the southwest. The last place to build a parking lot is over a river. And she looked at that and said, wait a minute, stop. And they said, no, we need to move on. So when I made the motion to direct the consultants to come back with an alternative $100 million or less, even if it was glue, and I mean literally there's glues that would be used, and it might last for 20 years, that's still a choice for the county. The consultants interrupted me and started arguing about NEPA and said, Council of Liberty, NEPA does not allow you to exclude expensive alternatives. I said, is that what I'm saying? I'm saying we need an inexpensive alternative to let the county pick. Back and forth, and then the chair says we need to move on. That was the end of it. From that point on, everything was $300 million. So that is consultant-driven or maybe staff. But I have no idea where that came from as an important part of the project. Yes, sir?
Ian Clancy, Transportation. I just want to go back to the slide where you had a map of Oregon and all the bridges that had more or less or the priority of bridges that were more likely to collapse.
Yeah.
And this might be a little bit off topic, but I noticed that a lot of the bridges that were more in danger of collapsing where near the coastline.
Yes.
I was wondering why those might be like lower on the priority list.
Well, I think the answer is from that report is there's more traffic volume on the bridges inland, so they had the first priority with the highest volume. But again, on earthquake safety, with a subduction quake, most of the deaths will be from tsunamis, and actually connections to the coast will be lost. So that's a bigger question, about where you can spend money if you're concerned about earthquakes. Liming, are we out of time?
No, I have one question. So
Okay.
you mentioned briefly kind of the challenge of discussing a big project through a committee.
Yeah.
But kind of from your experience of working across different projects, big bridges and so on, what's your take of how to make the committee decision-making, the public engagement process work?
Well, in the case of Selwood Bridge, I wanted to, and remember, I was representing the Metro Council because that was part of my district, but it wasn't a Metro investment. It was going to be a county investment. And I said, I think we need to respect our citizens and let them choose the topics where they think they can have the most to contribute, and we can have a discussion with them. So the same is true for us. But if you have masses of material and packed agendas, there can be no discussion. You really have to be strategic and say, what are the policy calls? And I think those, you can identify those. How much money do we have? How do these things compare? What do we think are the most important issues? Is it job access, public health, freight movement? Those are good policy calls, and from that you structure the project. I think NEPA has actually created a priesthood, and often with a lot of lawyers telling people what they can or cannot do, instead of saying, adapt the process to allow us to make a good decision. So I would narrow the questions down, I would clarify the context, I would call out the policy calls. That's what I would do. Yes, sir.
My question goes back to the CRC. So it seemed like the most efficient way to reduce congestion was the no-build scenario where you toll both bridges, which makes sense. So I'm wondering if such a proposal could be reincarnated as like maybe a CMAQ kind of proposal that could come back around, or if it's just kind of dead in the water at this point.
Well, by the way, the tolling revenue generation numbers were challenged by Joe Courtwright. He said no one would issue bonds on those forecasts, and they've been, the consulting firm for the forecast for revenues has been overestimated revenues for other projects in Washington. So it's not clear it ever would have been financed anyway. But I think the problem is demand management is very unpopular. So when people have talked about this, and you have to be creative politically, is to say, what if we were to toll a lane on 205 and a lane on I-5, and you're going to generate money, put that money into whatever is popular and useful, or put it in reserve, and experiment a little bit. And that's not easy for politicians, but it gives people a chance to get familiar with it, learn that don't need they have a transponder, your license plate, and see what the benefits are, and then you can size the project. I also think this project could have been handled if you're going to invest in the corridor incrementally. So one of the big problems is Hayden Island. It's the only way to get off and on the island. If there was a parallel small bridge going up from Interstate Avenue, you could put bikes, pedestrian, light rail if you wanted on it, and have different access and turn off those interchanges during rush hour. So that would probably cost less than the study. But there isn't any incentive to actually take these pieces and look at them in a small way. So I think demand management is possible, but so far it's been very difficult. Washington State is experimenting with it, so maybe we'll get some useful results.
Okay, we run out of time before we close. We have a holiday next week, so our final seminar 2 weeks from today will be Professor Allison Conway to talk about cargo cycles in New York City. And with that, let's thank Robert Nick